So let's begin at the beginning. What's EMP?
Well, an electromagnetic pulse is basically a super energetic radio wave. It's got so much power that it can destroy electronics across a huge area. In fact, across the entire world in the case of a superstorm, a solar superstorm. The EMP can be made by nature, by the sun, by a solar superstorm, or it can be made by man by a nuclear weapon. And it can be made by non-nuclear weapons as well.
Well, some lawmakers are calling this one of the most debilitating threats to Texas, the electromagnetic pulse, or EMP.
Doug, our food, our water supplies, electronics, hospital banking, all of it depends on the electronic grid. Now, in the event of a widespread EMP attack, all of that could be wiped out. Imagine one day if your lights, TV, and phone didn't work.
There'd be no water, no gas, no generators would start.
No electricity, all because of an electromagnetic pulse, an EMP, which is a powerful electric charge in the air that physically damages electronics within a given area. They can be given off by weather or a weapon.
Can you describe what the electrical grid looks like in this country and who runs the electrical grid in this country?
Sure, we have 3,000 different utilities that run the electric grid, which is privately owned. It's not run by the government, it's run by private
So these are companies or regional companies that all work with each other?
Yes, that's right. And we have our North American grid is divided into three parts, an eastern grid, a western grid, and a Texas grid. And Canada is part of our grid. Canada is on the same part of our grid. It's part of the eastern and western grid. So it's not just a U.S. grid. It includes Canada. And they're all wired together except for Texas, which has got its own independent.
Why is that, by the way?
Texas grid.
Just came about that way?
It just pretty much came about that way. There are regional entities that manage and try to coordinate these various grids, and Texas decided, decades ago that they wanted to be on their own.
And this you can just put on the wall. The water purification.
Some are already preparing for extreme situations.
That is a major concern.
Dana Ellington says that people come into his Richardson store every day worried about a severe power outage.
Food bars, food tablets, a little miniature stove.
And he's stocking up too. Water, food.
Our biggest sellers are the freeze-dried food.
When it comes to preparing for no electricity, I found out battery-operated items are the #1 seller, followed by solar.
You can be proactive or you can be reactive.
The reason some people want to be proactive now?
But Texas is also one of the primary targets that would be, because our grid is in three parts.
State Senator Bob Hall of Texas is working to shine a light on the issue. This study by the National Center for Policy Analysis illustrates Texas is the only state with a self-contained grid, making it vulnerable. He says his biggest concern if Texas goes dark.
Texas is also the home to the second largest group of military installations in the country,
which use the same kind of commercial power.
Taking out that part of our military would severely cripple our capability.
Hall says this isn't doom and gloom, but the state should take precautions. He'd like to see EMP shielding technologies installed on the grid system.
Electromagnetic pulse.
Yes.
Is that what electricity does as it moves? What does that mean exactly?
Well, think of it this way. I think everybody has had the experience of driving down a highway with your radio on, and then you pass under a high power line and you lose the radio. Then you come back out on the other side. That's basically all an EMP is. It's an electromagnetic field, all right? Except it's much more powerful than the field that you experience on the highway. Now imagine there's so much energy in that field that when you go through it, all the electronics in your car are destroyed. Now imagine that field is not just localized to a small spot on the highway, but it covers all of North America, and it would destroy electronics across that entire area. That's what could be accomplished if you had a single nuclear weapon and detonated it above the atmosphere, say at 300 kilometers or so, up in outer space. Mind you, this is a different kind of nuclear attack than the one people are used to thinking about. It wouldn't destroy a city, there'd be no fallout, there'd be no blast effects. If you were standing on the ground directly beneath the explosion and it was detonating overhead at 300 kilometers, or it could be as low as 30 kilometers, it's in the vacuum of space, so that you wouldn't even hear the explosion. There'd be no blast effects that would reach the ground. There'd be no radioactive fallout.
Cars, no ATM, no cell phones or computers, and nuclear reactors would actually melt down, causing a catastrophe. This is what will happen if, during what is known as an EMP attack, that is short for electromagnetic pulse. We had this warning that came out from a U.S. Air Force study. Explain what a terror group or a country can send up into the air and the impact it would have on our lives after such an attack called EMP.
Sure. 30 kilometers or higher, detonated, it produces a pulse that can really catastrophically harm small electronics and even large power transformers.
You don't really see it as you would see like big attacks as you would in, you know, a traditional type war. So all of a sudden you're driving and everything just stops working.
This is the type of attack that we really consider a kill shot for our adversaries. You know, because of the effect it has on our technology. This is the first time in human history where it doesn't take an entire civilization to overtake another because of our dependency on technology and particularly electricity. Any country or non-state actor for that matter that has a nuclear weapon and a delivery system to get it to 30 kilometers or higher, which could even be a weather balloon.
Unfortunately, like so many things, we don't make fundamental elements of the electric grid in this country anymore. The transformers aren't manufactured in the United States anymore. We have to import them from South Korea or Germany. And if these transformers were destroyed, it would basically end us as a civilization. They cannot be mass-produced. Each one has to be made individually by hand. The global production...
You said there's thousands of them.
2,000 of them, yes. 2,000 of them.
Do we have an inventory of them, backup sources for them within our own country?
We have a small number of replacement transformers, less than 1% in reserve. And in part, that's because it's so difficult to replace them. They weigh so much and they're so big. There's only 3 railway cars in the whole country that can move an EHV transformer. Bridges have to be reinforced, roads have to be widened, and that's assuming that the society is intact and you haven't lost other parts of the infrastructure, as would be the case in the aftermath of a catastrophic EMP. That's why it's not just the way to think of these dangerous blackouts that we're talking about. They're not temporary blackouts. When you lose EHV transformers and the control systems, another piece of technology that is fundamental to our civilization is called the SCADA, for Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition System. It's a control system that also runs everything. Both of these things are vulnerable to EMP, and if you lose them, that's it for us.
There are allegations that the Putin government signed off on efforts by hackers to penetrate critical infrastructure here in the United States, and this goes to nuclear, water, as well as electrical power grids.
From public reports that there are already efforts to plant malware or to seed malware in SCADA systems, et cetera. Is this something that you're familiar with and are concerned about?
I am aware that there has been reporting with regards to elements within our ICS and SCADA systems. That's something that should concern all of us.
And tonight concerned that Russian government hackers have carried out probing cyber attacks on vital U.S. infrastructure, including the power grid, potentially giving the Kremlin the ability to turn off the lights. Earlier this year, the Department of Homeland Security and FBI detailed a 2-year multi-stage effort by Moscow targeting hundreds of companies that they believe is still ongoing. The hackers first gained access to small energy-related companies, planting malware that then allowed them to move into larger networks. Once inside the energy suppliers, the Russians collected information on the facility's control systems, attempting to acquire the ability to turn those systems off.
They're identifying targets. They're positioning malware so they could pull the trigger when they wanted to.
From time to time in our country, we read of a state or a city that's without electricity for a few days.
Yes.
Things like that happen, and then they're able to put it back together in a relatively short period of time, but you can see even right there, 3, 4, 5 days, there's really a panic in place and so forth. And what you're saying is, imagine this nationwide.
Right. In fact, there's only a 30-day food supply in the country to feed 320 million people. And water would stop immediately. You know, when you turn on the tap, it requires millions of volts in order to deliver that water through your tap. And the commission couldn't figure out how would we keep 320 million people alive with no food and no water, possibly for years. We estimate that if we had a blackout in this country that lasted 1 year, and that's entirely possible in these scenarios that we're talking about, we could lose up to 90% of our population to starvation, disease, and societal collapse. In the case of a nuclear EMP attack, your car, could be fried, airplanes would fall out of the sky. Nuclear reactors would go Fukushima. We've got 100 nuclear reactors in this country.
5 George, 496 Broadway between Broome and Spring.
To get at America. And an easy way, quite frankly, is through an EMP attack, an electromagnetic pulse attack.
Consider every major city in America, how does it get its water supply? Consider that every major city in America, its average food supply on hand is 21 to 28 days. Consider, where do we get our medication? Consider what happens in nursing homes and hospitals. What happens to our transportation grid? Anything driven that, well, most of them have computers in them, they're all gone.
What do you do in the case of an EMP?
Electromagnetic pulse.
A burst of radiation that knocks out every electrical system in the country.
Impending doom.
What you reading, Dad?
Honey, everything's fine. There's nothing to worry about. When things go south, the sheeple will clean out every supermarket in town. Typical sheeple.
Let me repeat that. 90% of all Americans will die within 12 to 18 months after an EMP event. This study was done in 2008. Has anything been done since? No.
Our highly connected, just-in-time, efficient technological civilization to cause chaos that could cause tens of millions of Americans to die before it's sorted out.
Tens of millions?
Tens of millions, because if you have no electric power for 6 months to a year, you have no food delivery, you have no gasoline, you have no water. You think about that, it's pretty bad.
Well, that's a horrifying possibility. How are we protecting against that happening?
We're not.